All right. Good. This is a Saturday, December 8th. This is Houston, Texas. This is Brian Lance here with this video cast with LaRouche PAC and also with participation from Schiller Institute members. And I'll get underway here. We had a tremendous event. The Schiller Institute had a tremendous event last Saturday, a Schiller Fest, a belated birthday celebration for Friedrich Schiller. We had a great turnout from all walks of life, music, poetry, and we used as an idea to unify the event the writings of Percy Bysshe Shelley and Friedrich Schiller. And I think it's appropriate to start this class today, which is going to focus on economics, but start, and I think hopefully the event itself, the presentation and discussion will bear this out. Very appropriate to start with Shelley here. I'm going to start again at the end, the last part of the last paragraph of A Defense of Poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley. And I'll just read it, and then I think it'll become more apparent why this bears on our discussion, our conversation today. Here's Shelley. The most unfailing herald and companion and follower of the awakening of the great people to work a beneficent change in opinion or institution is poetry. And here's the crucial point, I think, for our discussion today. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul. So I start with that. And we have as a first slide a reflection of that. We have the neoliberal establishment of Europe that's crashing. We have Angela Merkel of Prime Minister of Germany. We have Theresa May in the middle of England. And on the right is Macron, the Prime Minister of France. President of France, excuse me. Soon to probably be neither. If you go back, or perhaps just in your mind go back and think about what you've seen or read, you'll recall that Merkel, after the election of President Donald Trump in the United States, was suddenly promoted as the new leader of the free world that would carry forward the standard of neoliberalism and liberalism in the West. And of course, Theresa May came in and as the fixer who was going to resolve the Brexit crisis. And now there's an open revolt in the British Parliament. Merkel, meanwhile, has just resigned her leadership of the Christian Democratic Party in Germany because of the collapse of support for the party in the polls, as with the other major parties. And she may be soon gone as chancellor. Macron on the right is the subject to an open revolt. You've probably been seeing some press coverage of this. The yellow vest movement, sometimes talked about as the yellow jacket movement, yellow vest or yellow jacket movement. Go to the next slide if you can. There's members of the yellow jackets. I had to search quite a bit to find this picture because most of the pictures available, at least in the US, the mass media, are of Molotov cocktail throwing radicals of the left or right. When this photograph certainly captures much more the spirit of the yellow vest movement which has sprung up all over Europe over the last, or all over France, but has spread into other countries in Europe over the last several weeks. And I really encourage people to go to the LaRouchePAC.com website, LaRouchePAC.com website, and watch the Friday night webcast, which interviews Jacques Cheminade, the longtime friend of Lyndon LaRouche, a collaborator and friend of Lyndon LaRouche, three-time candidate in France for president, who has been out there meeting and talking with the Yellow Vest movement and reports in depth on what is occurring there. This is what Shelley was talking about in terms of a mass strike upsurge, which is going on now. The open question in all these cases, Germany, in England, and in France, is a question of leadership. What is going to replace these institutions that are falling as a result of the lack of popular support for any of these parties or policies coming from the so-called left or the right or the middle, which all share in common a liberal or neoliberal outlook. They're all collapsing. As President Trump said today, December 8th, in a tweet, the Paris Agreement is not working so good in Paris. The trigger for the events in France was a fuel tax on gas and diesel that was announced by Macron, President Macron of France. It's not really a huge increase. I mean, it's roughly 24 cents a gallon on diesel, 12 cents on gas. But this was simply the trigger. This was the last straw for a population that's been driven to the edge, which can no longer support itself. It really, if you think of the spread of the opioid epidemic in the United States, the devastation of middle America between the two coasts through deindustrialization, the effects of austerity policies, budget cutting, and so on, here, that was very much part of what fueled the election of now President Donald Trump. This is the same process that you see underway in Europe, starting with Brexit, but continuing now with the Yellow Vest movement in France. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but it does set the background to then what we otherwise saw in terms of new developments at the G20 summit, which the next slide points out a photograph from one aspect of that, which is the trilateral meeting between Presidents Putin of Russia, President Xi Jinping of China, and Prime Minister Modi of India. The first such meeting in a number of years, which are now going to be regularized and standardized, that they realize their increasing necessary role as leaders in the world in what is becoming otherwise an increasing vacuum. And one way of thinking about this process, I mean, these are major countries. These are three of what we call the four powers that should be the initiators of a new Bretton Woods, which is the subject of the discussion today. If we think about this as a context, then another feature of the well, let's see here. I got to figure out how to do this. Another feature of the summit, the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, November 30th through December 1st, which was the agreements reached between President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China. There in the photograph, of course, President Xi Jinping is there on the far right, Donald Trump in the middle, and Donald Trump's wife in the middle. This was, again, something that occurred as a result of leadership, of intention, of individuals putting themselves forward. Again, as Friedrich Schiller stated, and he could have been speaking to these leaders, Donald Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Modi, embolden thyself to be wise, which is a challenge to all of us, to really comprehend that mankind is greater than his destiny. Again, to paraphrase Schiller, that this is really what's required now, because the old order, the neoliberal order, is breaking down. The question is, can we bring together, can we impel the leaders of these 4 key countries to step forward now, with other nations as well, to convene a new Bretton Woods, to reorganize a broken down economic system, but also culturally, sociologically, if you will, broken down system, to create a future for mankind. So continuing here, we have a lot to build on. The United States has a lot to build on. We just landed the InSight lander on Mars, and we're getting back the first reports from that landing, and that's going to be unfolding over coming weeks and months as the equipment is deployed, having been tested, and so on and so forth. This is an advance for mankind. We have the breakthroughs, as we talked a bit about last week, and as among others, Joel Dijon has presented in depth here in other presentations, and is available in the latest issue of Executive Intelligence Review. We have the tremendous promise and growing promise of fusion energy, of controlled thermonuclear fusion. This is a picture from the Lawrence Livermore laser ignition facility, right? 192 lasers directed at the chamber with a small, tiny bit of fuel. They achieved this last early summer a doubling of fusion energy produced, and they've also reached the highest levels of energy input into the chamber that's yet been achieved. This is just an example of where we are leading as part of an international effort, which should be much more robust, including on our part, most importantly. But nonetheless, these are, again, another area in which we can advance rapidly. This is an application, a diagram of the application of fusion energy to fusion rocketry, which can get us to Mars in a matter of weeks, and can deliver a great deal more in terms of supplies, material, manpower, and so forth when we get around to that after developing the moon, which we've got to take as a first step in that direction. But this is where we need to be headed. And I think next week, Keisha Rogers will be presenting much more on this, as she did last Thursday on the Fireside Chat, which is also available on the LaRouche PAC website. But if we get back to capturing the potential that existed, here's a chart. Some of you have seen it before, a chart of the growth and transformation of the United States energy sources and capabilities. You see the growth of energy flux density rising vertically on the diagram. You see the timeline across the bottom moving from left to right. And those white empty spaces with arrows there on the far right are the projections of where we should have been, could have been, by the year 2000 or thereabouts, if we had gone ahead with the full development of fission energy and or combined with fusion. We could have been in a whole nother domain. But this process of transformation, moving from wood to coal to oil and gas, should have been and could have been continued. And we've got to get back on track. And we're fully capable of doing that, particularly in collaboration with the other four powers, other three of the four powers, and other nations, Japan and so forth. And that is, as we continue to emphasize, and we necessarily must continue to emphasize it, because this goes right back to Friedrich Schiller's point about man being greater than his destiny. is the increases of energy flux density that mankind has achieved, and the resulting growth of the human population, the development of society, the increase of lifespan, the lowering of mortality rates. All of this is, and the development of nature, the flourishing of nature has been achieved over the long haul through this process, a process that not only is reflected in the development of society, but in the development of the universe as we understand it around us. If we understand the universe correctly as a developing creative process itself. A few weeks ago, I presented some on, some of you recall this picture. This is the ring forging of part of a fission reactor vessel here. Well, this is actually taking place in Japan, I believe. We don't have the capability anymore to produce this kind of thing. This is the sort of capacity we have to regain very rapidly as a component, the more basic component of our machine tool capacities more generally, forging being the most elemental. And the next, I wanted to bring forward this. This is a picture of a modern CNC machine tool factory, for lack of a better word, floor. You see just the array of machines there, 3, 4, 5 axle machine tools. You'll see, if you can, in detail, you'll see workers at some of those stations. Not all of the machinery is being used at the same time. This is not an assembly line. These are specialty tools with special capabilities in which high precision quality parts, components are developed, built both as prototypes, but also as finished products going into jet aircraft and other equipment that requires high precision, high tolerances, and so forth. This is the conveyance from prototype to the real world of development of real physical economies. Now, in counterposition to these capabilities, which we still have, not what we require. I mean, it was just pointed out today in a conference call on some of these subjects by Bill Roberts there in Michigan. The average age of a tool and die worker in the United States is 56 years old. 75% of all the tool and die workers, which can be broadly said to kind of encompass machine tool operators and the people that design and build machine tools, 75% of them are going to retire in the next 10 years. They're slated for retirement. So you're emphasizing more. Yeah, less of the die, actually. We need less die and more tool and die. We need more. And we need to extend the productive lifespans of those tool and die workers. But counterposes, this is the context. Many of you saw this. General Motors, at the end of November, just a week ago, announced that they're closing 5 major plants, and they're laying off 15% of their salaried staff. That's salaried staff. That's the engineers. That's the auto design people. That's and there's this whole interface between design and engineers and tool and die. That's where all these things get worked out. How do you actually build something that hasn't been built before? This is what's being targeted, not simply white collar in the traditional sense of shuffling paper, financial activity, and so forth. And 5 major plants, Lordstown in Ohio, and so forth, major plants are being closed down. And it's not because General Motors isn't making money. At the moment, they're making money. But they say they're planning for the future. A shift to all electric. They're attempting to share capabilities, components across different lines of production, you know, Chevrolet, Pontiac, and so on. They're phasing out all sedan production and so forth. They're thinking in terms of a shrinking world, right? And shrinking demand, not just for gas cars, but any kind of vehicles. And anyway, so I bring this up to say that we really are at a crisis point, and at the same time, it reposes for us the issue posed by Lyndon LaRouche, economist, statesman, in 2005, 2006. Not only posed, but we organized in conjunction with him a major national effort to retool auto production for high-speed rail, you know, to build a national high-speed rail network, among other projects required. Nuclear power plants. You know, there's an ongoing discussion right now. Well, what, you know, perhaps the aerospace defense sector, if we move to retool part of that. Trump has tweeted out this last week that he hopes to soon be talking with Xi Jinping of China and Putin of Russia on winding down the arms race, that we're spending far too much, that it's crazy, he said, for the U.S. to be spending now $760 billion in the current fiscal year on so-called defense. Well, what are you going to do with that capability, including skilled workforce? If we begin retooling that, well, some of that is actually perhaps better suited for the production of components for high-speed rail. On the other hand, there certainly are parts of the floor of major car manufacturing facilities that would be suitable for the development of large forging capabilities, ring forging capabilities, because we're going to need a lot of nuclear power plants, hundreds of them. And we don't even have the capability of producing the vessels for them at this point. So in 2005, 2006, we were posing, you know, that simply, if we set a goal of, say, 17,000 miles of high quality rail, high speed and otherwise, that we would need approximately 10,000 electrical locomotives to be built. We would need 50,000 megawatts of additional power. That's 50 gigawatts. That's 50 nuclear power plants, or maybe 75 gas power plants. We would need 26,000 double track miles of rail to overhaul the existing rail system as well as add to it. What we're using now is virtually all for freight, and most of that is coal and other bulk commodities. We would need minimally 10 million tons of high quality, high tensile steel for that. So we were proposing that in 2005, 2006, all the more so today. So but think of these as not as enormous expenses. These are enormous productivity, enormous productive activity that we can move to. We should be moving to now to actually meet the requirements of future generations, as opposed to being caught in this entropic process of collapse that's now gripping the entire transatlantic region in physical economic terms, that's producing the Brexits and the yellow vest protests and the collapse of the Christian Democratic Party in Germany and the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and so on and so forth, and has created this underlying it all, created this unraveling of the U.S. So again, this is front and center. Now, I mentioned this 2 weeks ago in my presentation. I'm going to mention just two figures again. I don't want people's eyes to glaze over. I thought they kind of glazed over last time. But Ben Denniston and Jason Ross from our science team, our base, they call it the basement. They've been working through calculations, increasingly refined, but they, in terms of calculations that they worked through in November, just a couple of highlights. that if we were going to move mankind up to, say, 1970 US standards of living, we've fallen from that by far since. But if we were going to move the entire world population up to 1970 standards of living, say over the next course of the next 2 generations, to a 10 to 13 kilowatt consumption per capita, we would need a 5-fold increase in primary energy consumption. But in fact, that's a lot. But we also, since the bulk of that has to be electrical. I mean, right now, a lot of people are living on, you know, on wood and cow dung and so on and so forth as fuel. To actually move the world to a consumption per capita level approximate to 1970 or better over the next 2 generations, actually better, if I recall the figures correctly, then we would need a 9 to 15 times, a 9 to 15-fold increase in the amount of electricity production. So you're talking about, you know, thinking about it in current terms, you're talking about 25 to 40,000 nuclear power plants worldwide required. Or you can count it in terms of 80 to 130,000 small modular reactors. And that's not just bringing into the picture fusion. It underscores why we've got to move more rapidly, mankind, our nation as well, more rapidly to fusion energy, because just calculating these numbers and crunching these numbers, you know, you come up with staggering figures in terms of inputs required. So we're going to have to become much more effective, efficient, productive by an order of magnitude. I think that's fair to say. But that's the scale on which we have to be thinking as mankind. And right now, just so you have an idea, these are this is one category of machine tool production, cutting type machine tools, as opposed to drilling and so forth, or lathe machines. But it gives you an idea of it quickly here. These are the countries. You see them listed by color code. You could confuse Japan and the United States. Japan is up here, kind of bouncing around. You know, they've had their booms and busts in Japan. They're locked into this Western financial system. They're trying to break out of it now with China and the Belt and Road. But the other blue line is down towards the bottom, and that's the U.S. down here. And you see that we've been, as presented here, bumping along the bottom since the 1990s, producing $2 billion roughly of machine tools of this type per year for now going on 20 years. And that was after falling for much higher levels earlier. But this is just to give you a sense of where we are now. But compare that to, say, China. You see that in the well, kind of a rust-colored color. They're far from a Rust Belt economy. You see them peaking now at over $14 billion of machine tools per annum. These figures only go through 2010. They've increased further. And they're now producing, 5-axis machine tools. They're producing this quality machine tool. I should say, not on the quality of Japan or West Germany or even the best in the United States, but they're getting there. So this is why we need a four-power agreement on a new Bretton Woods. And what I want to do at this point is give a little, because I know it's still not clear to people, and many people are just being introduced to these ideas for the first time. It's not clear what we mean by a new Bretton Woods. I mean, what was the old Bretton Woods? If you're talking about a new Bretton Woods, what was the old Bretton Woods? And more importantly, I think it's to actually discuss, where did that old Bretton Woods come from? What was the thinking behind it a bit? And I'm going to be drawing on a book. We've had a national discussion kind of kicking around of this book in the last few months. It's called The Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods. international development and the making of the post-war order. And it's written by Eric Helleiner. He's a Canadian. He did a lot of work delving into archives as far away as Uruguay to pull together the picture on this. I really recommend the book, although it's dry and academic in many parts, but nonetheless, the story it tells is a remarkable one. But first, I want to say that, to get from where we are today to where we should be in 2 generations, lighting up Africa, as President Putin of Russia said it during the BRICS conference there in Johannesburg, Africa, a couple of months ago. To do what China's now doing, as you know, yesterday our time, at about 12:30 our time, China's Chang'e 4 rover lifted off for the moon, for the backside of the moon. This is going to be an enormous accomplishment. It'll be the first man's first landing on the dark side, so-called, the backside of the moon, with tremendous scientific work that's going to be done there. But it's now lifted off, and it should become a new Sputnik. Keisha Rogers is challenging Americans to take this as a new Sputnik. If people recall from their history books, if not from their living memory, what happened when the Soviet Union sent up the first man-made satellite, Sputnik. That was a shock heard around the world, and it became the driver for a vastly expanded, already existing on a small scale, but vastly expanded U.S. space program. The Chang'e 4, Chang'e is the moon goddess in Chinese mythology. The liftoff of the Chang'e 4 should really be a challenge for us to seriously get back to the moon, which means doing on Earth and producing here on Earth what gets us there. But to do that, it takes more than numbers or even machine tools. This is a poster from a recent concert of ours in New York City, a major concert featuring Mass in C minor by Beethoven. And you see in the poster here, looking on over Beethoven's shoulder, so to speak, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And this was on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of those two great American leaders. But the idea content, the emotional content, the creative content, where does that come from? There has to be an intention to create the good and the beautiful, and that I want to just underscore as we lead into discussing the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was the result of Franklin Roosevelt's work. Just to underscore very briefly, or not underscore, but just kind of point in the direction. Maybe some people will be encouraged to investigate a little bit more. Franklin Roosevelt's life. As some of you know, Franklin Roosevelt came down with polio when he was 39 years old. Grown man, married, had children, and he was struck with polio. And was already, active in politics and so forth. Yet, as a result of this picture is taken in 1924. That's the lieutenant governor of New York on the left-hand side there. Al Smith's on the far right. Roosevelt is there on crutches. You don't see many pictures of that, but this is early on. He came down with polio 3 years earlier in 1921. But Roosevelt withdrew from political life to fight polio, which was very little understood at the time, to engage in all kinds of therapies and efforts. And it's reported by his family that, of course, at first the children were particularly horrified to see their father suddenly, suffering in the way that he was. But then really struck by his intention to overcome this debilitating disease, and joined as they could in the effort. And I think that's some of the background to understanding Elliott Roosevelt, who wrote the famous book, a profound book on, as he saw it, on the intentions of Roosevelt in creating the post-World War II order. But Roosevelt not only fought the disease, I mean, sure, what else could he do if he wasn't going to just give up? But the point is that he went on, he learned of this Warm Springs in Georgia, hot springs in Warm Springs, Georgia, that this was having a very beneficial effect. And he visited there to the Meriwether Inn there in Warm Springs, but it was in financial trouble within a short time for other reasons. And so he raised the money, pooled the money to buy it, and open it up as a facility for polio victims, and expanded the facility and so forth. Now it's a national park, which can be visited and so forth. But his battle. He's here. I don't know if he quite comes across, but that's Roosevelt right down here in the pool with a bunch of other, regular Joes, that might today be, if they were in France, wearing yellow vests, and this is him on the edge of the pool there. You can see his withered legs. This is already early. This is in the late 1920s or early 30s. And this is him with some of the kids there. So this led to he carried out annual. He re-entered politics, even though he obviously hadn't defeated the disease. As most people know, it was with him the rest of his life. The Salk vaccine wasn't developed until shortly after his death. But in the meantime, he ran annual birthday balls on his birthday to raise money for the center, and then created in 1938 the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. That's what otherwise polio was known as. Which created in turn the March of Dimes, if you remember that, and led to the Salk vaccine. And I put this quote up again. This is from Alexander Hamilton, from his, I believe this is from the Report on National Credit, and I've underlined the what I think is the most salient quote here. This has been with us. These ideas have been with us from the founding of the nation. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. And at the very end, the spirit of enterprise, useful and prolific as it is, must necessarily be contracted or expanded in proportion to the simplicity or variety of the occupations and productions which are to be found in the society. It must be less in a nation of mere cultivators than in a nation of cultivators and mechanics, less in a nation of cultivators and mechanics than in a nation of cultivators, artificers, and merchants. So the idea here being, again, as he said, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind. We otherwise know this in the Christian faith as agape. And this is what we are tapping into with the Schiller Institute and our organizing activity. And I think it's a very important component to what we are doing and need to be doing over the coming weeks and months to drive this process forward. Now, I think you also see this reflected as we talk now, and we saw it reflected in the campaigns of Keisha and Ron Wazorik for Congress that were just completed, and their ongoing work right now. And you see it in our work just in the recent weeks. We had in Washington, D.C., a delegation from Italy. I believe it's Antonio Garacci. There's Paul Gallagher, Marco Fanini. Garacci is the Undersecretary for Development, responsible for development for Italy. Paul Gallagher from the EIR, Economics Editor. Marco Fanini, the Member of Parliament, European Parliament from Italy. And Alicia Sertani of LaRouche PAC there in Washington, D.C. They were there to meet with congressmen and senators. They had a petition signed by over 217 leading figures in Italy, many of them members of the government now in Italy, in support of a new Bretton Woods concept, in support of Glass-Steagall where it's on the platform of both of the two parties that are the ruling coalition, and calling for U.S. support for those policies in the United States. But you'll also find it in the early history of the lead up to the creation of the Bretton Woods. And to understand that, I'm going to try to make this very compact and go through this very quickly. In the creation, or the proposed creation, of what was called the Inter-American Bank, this was a proposal put on the table as the United States recovered from the Great Depression, buoyed by the confidence created and inspired by the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation driven economic development programs across the country, and its success. Roosevelt called for, and of course this is in the late 1930s now, and Hitler had come to power, and it was clear that he was not going to stop his madness. So that was a feature to this also. But fundamentally, it was driven by the qualities which I just identified with Franklin Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt called for initiation of a large-scale program of development throughout the Americas. Beginning first with the expansion of the Export-Import Bank, which was then funded at a mere $200 million up to $700 million. And among the first things it did upon the expansion of the funding was to launch the building of the first steel mill in all of Latin America, which was in Brazil. Roosevelt was very clear on what and why this was necessary, this new initiative. He, in 1939, calling for this perspective, he said that the ancient frauds of the 1920s should not interfere with new sound loans under consideration for the development of the economies of the Americas. That was his language in calling for this expansion, first of all, of the Ex-Im Bank. And then in 1940, we have the following report. This is Harry Dexter White, the gentleman you see on the left. Both of these are key individuals in the Roosevelt administration, in his brain trust. But let me give you what Harry Dexter White had to say. He had just attended a conference in Havana as part of a discussion with Latin American leaders. Well, I'm sorry, this is not to quote him, but to stress a point that he was making at that point, that the U.S. Treasury now needed to additionally increase currency stabilization loans throughout the Americas. And then in 1940, Roosevelt instructed the interdepartmental committee that was working on these plans to solve the problem of external debts throughout Latin America. What was the problem then? The problem was that, I quoted Roosevelt already, the countries throughout the Americas were highly indebted, as if we haven't heard that story before. And this was through the predatory practices of London and Wall Street, in which these countries were borrowing money at high interest rates through compradors within their own nations, in other words, there's a great deal of corruption involved in the projects that were funded in the first place. The countries were then subject to currency manipulation, which, and of course, their loans had to be repaid in dollars, not in local currencies. And so the countries found their debt compounded, right? They had to take out new loans to cover their old loans. And this process went on continuously. At the same time, the prices of their raw materials exports were being driven downward. You can imagine in the course of the 1930s depression what happened to prices out of South America or Africa or other so-called developing areas. And of course, no money, absolutely no money, was made for actual industrialization of these countries themselves. Those loans were simply not made. The only loans made were short-term, which made investment into industry impossible. So Roosevelt calls for a reversal of this debts. External debts, again, to quote, external debts should be faced realistically, and these debts should not stand in the way of constructive financial and trade assistance. Study should be given to the refunding of these debts. And it's added here, it's reported here in the Highliner book, that by 1941, by the spring, essentially, all of the outstanding debts with the developing countries had been wiped off the books. Companies, debt collection committees of banks and so forth and so on had given up since the U.S. government was no longer going to back them in their ongoing predatory practices. And going forward then was the proposal for creating what was called, as I mentioned before, the Inter-American Bank. And I want to give you a sense of that from reading from Adolf Burrell, a speech he gave in June of 1941, a brief section of that speech. Burrell is the gentleman there on the right. He's a New Yorker. He was professor of corporate law there in New York. He was later a diplomat. He was part of the original brain trust of Franklin Roosevelt, brought on board because he wrote a famous book at that time on corporate governance that's already reflected a kind of reformist, new reformist thinking that was emerging at that time around Roosevelt's victory and so forth. I mean, it had already been published and widely circulated. So he came on board. He was a fluent Spanish speaker, and in fact had been in the Dominican Republic when American soldiers slaughtered Dominicans in an uprising, which he had been horrified at. Anyway, gives you a little bit of a sense of him and his background. But he was brought in as the top advisor to President Roosevelt on international financial policy. So that's his role at this time. So in June 1941, here is from his speech: 19th century economic imperialism is dead as a brontosaurus. Okay, a brontosaur. He suggested the Export-Import Bank and the Reconstruction and Finance Corporation, quote, are vividly interested in whether the development is a good thing in itself, meaning we want development. That's got to be the measuring rod. In other words, we have shifted our entire point of view. Instead of being anxious, he's speaking for the administration, being anxious to find a place where a group of people who have privately saved money can secure a private stream of profits, we are anxious rather to find opportunities for sound development, which may add to the general safety, security, and well-being of the Western Hemisphere. Before modern production techniques had created such abundance, a general rise in standards of living everywhere were necessary. Standards of living shall approximate the highest standards in the area. And carried to its logical conclusion, all this must require a high degree of economic planning and at the same time a high degree of open trade between the American nations. In the combination of the new conceptions with the new mechanisms, we have already gone a long way towards establishing the foundations of what will be the cooperative international economics of the future. This is a foretaste of the Bretton Woods. I'll just read the last part. In the combination of the new conceptions with the new mechanisms, we have already gone a long way towards establishing the foundation of what will be the cooperative international economics of the future. Governments have a critical role to play, and the U.S. government is intent now, as it's already expressing that intention in rebuilding the United States, to now broaden this to an effort throughout the hemisphere. Now, this history is almost unknown. If you read Politics of Latin America, history books on Latin America from the left, this didn't happen. If you read it from the right, it definitely didn't happen. Let me just quote J. Edgar Hoover from the time. Right? This then head of the FBI, right? U.S. politics, U.S. policy towards Latin America is being taken over by un-American radicals, quote unquote. And so let's go to some of the features. As you could tell, he was still talking in the context of the Export-Import Bank and Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but he's talking about this new concept of an inter-American bank, which is already being discussed over a period of years. There were conferences throughout Latin America, South America, the top economic advisors, top leaders of countries throughout the Americas were involved in these. And they also played a significant role in the Bretton Woods Conference itself later on. Just to make clear, this was not one-sided. This was not the U.S. simply saying, okay, here's what we want to do. This was the result of a great deal of in-depth consultation, somewhat similar to what you see with the Belt and Road Initiative today between China and the nations throughout Central Asia and Africa, and now the Americas again. So let me just find my bearings here and move quickly on through. Again, this is from the Highliner book, Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods. In June 1939, Simon Hansen, who is a younger graduate of Harvard, had written to White with a proposal for an institution headquartered in Latin America that would facilitate capital flows to Latin American countries in default by guaranteeing their new bond issues. This is an interesting concept. If you're thinking in terms of a new Bretton Woods and how we're going to finance development in developing countries, there's lots of different mechanisms that can be used. Includes, guarantees of bonds issued by those countries to import capital goods for development. In Latin American countries, guaranteeing their new bond issues. In an echo of Mexico's 1933 proposal, Hansen also suggested that the body could elect commissioners general to force debt resettlement deals on past defaults within 2 years. In other words, clearing the past record of defaults as well as settling outstanding default issues. And this is again a quote from Hansen, who closely collaborated with White. He expresses his frustration on U.S. policy towards Latin America. He said, the president, he's talking about Roosevelt, the president has spoken sharply about the ancient fraud of Latin American loans of the 1920s, but his administrators have given the bondholders the identical dollar diplomatic protection which they would have received from an administration that openly catered to bondholders. So you see this internal tussle, this push to rapidly move forward with these new reforms. And so Dexter White in 1939 formalizes one of the Inter-American Bank proposals, early ones, and proposes it to be initiated with $300 million in common stock by the U.S. government, with the power to issue $700 million in bonds, and with the capability of up to $1 billion more, and proposes this as a building on the idea that the U.S. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau had floated the previous month for a bank of North and South America. Here's on the bank's sole function, he says, White in his proposal, the bank's sole function would be to assist in promoting the long-term economic development of Latin America. But there's many features of this, and I just want to quickly rattle them off rather than read here. It would finance U.S. exports to throughout the Americas. It would provide short-term gold and silver loans to stabilize currencies. I mentioned already the continual crises in the developing countries as their currencies were bankrupted or virtually, bankrupted, which we again saw in the course of the 1980s and 90s as a result of Volcker's high interest rate policies here. U.S. interest rates policies in the United States went to 20% under the Council on Foreign Relations 1980s project being implemented. With 20% interest rates here, the loans taken out, contractually as dollars had to be repaid in dollars, and the interest rates floated with the value of the dollar, and the dollar, the going interest rate as set by the Federal Reserve. So third world debt suddenly overnight in 1980, the entire third world, essentially, so-called at the time, was utterly bankrupt. The Americas, most importantly. But this was not the first time this was through. So this was very directly addressed here in 1939 by the Roosevelt administration. Low interest, long-term loans for development of public works and infrastructure are spelled out as absolute sine qua non. Projects would remain under the control of the Latin American countries and Latin American businesses. The goal was to develop industrial enterprises in Latin America, and there would be no U.S. government intervention. It was continually emphasized, publicly as well as otherwise, in the affairs of the respective nations. In addition, there was a plan to stabilize commodity prices, which began with the Export-Import Bank initiative, again to ensure that the prices that countries in South America were getting for their products that were being exported, including things like rubber, important for the war effort, that these prices would be maintained, at a stable level, at a parity, what we might call parity pricing level. And there would be a shutdown of flight capital into the United States from the countries of Latin America. In fact, they actually set up a recycling mechanism. The Inter-American Bank proposal was that the IAB would sell its own bonds to Latin American investors, right, and soak up like a sponge anyone whose money wanted to flee out of Latin America, the IAB would offer them a better return, right? So they would invest into the Inter-American Bank bonds, and then the Inter-American Bank would lend the money, back basically at cost to the countries from which it came. These were all features of the Inter-American Bank proposal. Now, the proposal did not pass. It sat in the Congress, was killed in the Congress. This was part of the war that went on against Roosevelt in the final 4+ years of his administration. It just doesn't start in the last year or so. But it didn't pass. However, this was literally the basis for the U.S. proposals of what became the Bretton Woods proposal. It was Harry Dexter White. He is of just Jewish Lithuanian background. His parents were from Lithuania. He served in World War I and at Harvard, and again brought on as a top figure in the Roosevelt administration early on. So Harry Dexter White was the U.S. representative to Bretton Woods, and I quoted from him, as you recall, and so he gives you some idea of his thinking. Let me just wrap this up. The two features I just want to underscore on this is, first of all, in terms of the idea of the bank, the World Bank, and in terms of the fund, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. These were the two major financial institutions created at Bretton Woods. The role of the World Bank, initially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The Brits wanted the word development taken out. Others, the New York bankers, didn't want that term in there. I mean, there was a fight over all these policies against the Inter-American Bank and against the Bretton Woods proposals, but they didn't even want the word development in there. This was enough to set off alarm bells, right? But that's what it was initially called. The World Bank was initially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, officially, when it was founded. The purpose of that bank was to do exactly that, to finance, to pool funds, generate credit, to finance reconstruction and development worldwide. Not reconstruction for Europe, but worldwide. That was the intention, directly taking pages out of the Inter-American Bank proposal. Harry Dexter White's own work in particular. And the fund, the International Monetary Fund, the purpose of the International Monetary Fund was to lend short-term money to stabilize currencies. That was the point. And stabilize, the trading arrangements between various countries within and outside of the advanced sector. Again, along the lines of the Inter-American Bank features, and as well curtailing capital flight in the process of this. So this was the concept, the American proposal for a new Bretton Woods, as opposed to the Keynesian British proposal. John Maynard Keynes was the leading British representative at Bretton Woods. Their views prevailed far less, in part because there was a huge voting delegation from the countries of Latin America. The British complained about this, that they were being outvoted, that the U.S. was bringing all their friends, from Latin America, also from Ethiopia. There was, because most of what now are nations in Africa were not independent nations at the time, but Ethiopia was there as a nation. But also China was represented. They had a huge delegation representing the ideas of Sun Yat-sen being carried forward. So first of all, Keynes proposed that, look, we should negotiate this all between the U.S. and Britain. We should run. We need to organize this post-World War II order just among us. And Roosevelt and company would have nothing to do with that. And so then all these other delegates are being brought in. A wide net is cast. And so as a result, the Americans won out. Roosevelt was an old hand at party politics. Won out, in the votes of the conference. But within a year of his death, this is all being undone. Just to summarize very quickly, the first president of the World Bank was Eugene Meyer, who had been the chairman of the Federal Reserve under Hoover. So this is going right back into the soup, right back into, to the 1920s and 30s policies, early 30s policies. This is the same Eugene Meyer that went on to buy the Washington Post, and Catherine Grimeyer and all the rest, right, that we know down to today. And then he left after only 6 months, naming John McCloy as his successor. You can look up John McCloy. But he only agreed to succeed Meyer if key individuals who were part of the old Brain Trust were not kicked out first, and their collaborators from Latin America. So only then would he come in. And he appointed as his number 2 Eugene Black, who was executive vice president of Chase Bank. So no loans were made. Essentially, loans. Immediately the Latin American countries were revolting against the leadership. They were being betrayed, right? There were speeches made about I can't even read my own writing here. But this horrible onslaught of Latin American nationalism. This has to be stopped. In other words, free market economics has to be imposed here. And so this becomes the process. Development, in other words, the very word development, but also the concept development was written out of these institutions, right? So the International Monetary Fund becomes the vehicle for conditionalities, right? World Bank loans are only on the basis of meeting conditionalities and appropriate technology. And so economic development is shattered. And that's why we need a new Bretton Woods. And I think at this point probably this is the meeting. These are the leaders of all the delegations at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, where the original Bretton Woods Agreement was reached. The Bretton Woods Agreement set up fixed exchange rates. It tied the dollar and other currencies to gold. Fixed exchange rates is perhaps the most important thing to emphasize. It through fixed exchange rates, it meant that the currencies, the values of various currencies, did not fluctuate against each other. But more importantly, it closed the window on currency speculation. And the movement of flight capital and just capital generally around the world. It reined it in and did create the basis for a period of relative economic development relative to the pre-Depression years, or the up through the chaos up through the Depression years before Roosevelt's solution. The Bretton Woods Agreement, as I think most people here know, was suddenly ended in a shocking speech by Richard Nixon on August 15th, 1971, a 20-minute speech to the nation, announcing that he was decoupling the dollar from gold, actually initially devaluing the dollar by about 10% versus gold for the first time since the Bretton Woods Agreement had been reached. The result of that then was to set off a chain of events such that by 2 years later, the British Empire had achieved a complete float of the dollar and every other major currency. And so the entire fixed exchange rate system was out the window. At this point, I think the best thing to do to fill in is to go to the video that was just prepared by Jason Ross. And we're going to show it here. It's a 7-minute video, which is up on the LaRouche PAC website, and available to be used to be tweeted out, to be shared on Facebook. We should really get this 7-minute video around. It doesn't go through what I've gone through. I hope that what I've said complements what Jason presents in terms of why we need a new Bretton Woods now. So if we can, let's go to that. Question and answer discussion.
World War II, Roosevelt pulled together. At the end of World War II, Roosevelt pulled together the great powers of the world to work out the post-war economic order. He wanted an economic system that would encourage development and which would end colonialism in all its forms across the world. The resulting 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, although it was plagued with compromises made to the British, created an international system that overall was a framework for industrial development around the world. But in 1971, that Bretton Woods system and the conceptions underlying it were overturned, and it made the world become increasingly controlled by a small grouping of financiers and oligarchs centered in the world's financial headquarters, the City of London, and with offshoots in Wall Street and other major financial centers. Since then, this modern British financial empire has exerted its power through control over currency values, through cartels, and through financial manipulations of the deliberately unstable international economy. This imperial system, which survives by sucking value from the real economy, it's run its course. We have to shut it down and replace it before the next financial crash, which is already on its way. In this video, we'll review how the US economy has been ruined by this British financial empire, and we'll put forward the LaRouche vision of what a new Bretton Woods will look like. After the huge economic mobilization for World War II, which was made possible by the infrastructure projects of Roosevelt's New Deal, the US economy continued to grow. In the 50s and in the 60s, we benefited from new dams, providing hydroelectric power and irrigation. We developed nuclear power for the world. We developed rockets for space travel and defense. We developed lasers. We developed computers. And we produced more steel than we do today. Per capita use of energy increased, and productivity growth remained high. The US dollar was the reserve currency of the world system. Its value was stable relative to gold. The strong basic infrastructure and the high productive capacity of American industry and agriculture, the growing productivity of workers and farmers, this backed up the dollar's function as the reserve currency. At least it did back then. The banks of the biggest industrial countries, including the US, were regulated by versions of Franklin Roosevelt's anti-speculation Glass-Steagall Act, keeping banking stable. At least they were back then. Here's an example of international affairs. Here we see the value of the German Deutsche Mark expressed in dollars. It's stable. So if the American government or a business wants to extend a loan or an investment into Germany, they know that the currency rate will be stable. The prices of the commodities sold will be stable. And under this stability, the nation will develop economically, businesses will grow, and the credit can be repaid. Or at least it could back then. Under that Roosevelt-Bretton Woods monetary system, not only was global infrastructure development possible, the system itself was designed to facilitate it. So, what happened? This is not today's world. What happened to that industrial might? What happened to all those jobs? What happened to that stability? Remember, in order to incentivize capital investments in production and infrastructure, that Bretton Woods system had put up strong barriers against money flowing around the world for speculation, for gambling, for finance. But by the 1960s, the British financial empire had had enough, and they moved to destroy the rules of this Bretton Woods system from within. London wanted control of the world reserve currency, and they got their way. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon turned over control of our US dollar to the City of London when he ended the dollar's value in relation to gold. Within 2 years, London forced the replacement of the Bretton Woods system with the floating exchange rate system. Now, the value of every currency constantly fluctuates. Within less than 10 years of this 1971 shift, 80% of all the supposedly US dollars in circulation were being created not in the United States, but in the City of London and in its offshore banking centers like the Cayman Islands. The world reserve currency had become the London dollar, unstable, no longer a real reserve. Let's look at what happened. Remember that stable exchange rate between the German Deutsche Mark and the US dollar? Well, here's what happened to it after 1971. More dramatically, consider the case of the Mexican peso. London called the system floating exchange rates. And while their banks might have been floating, overall the world economy has been drowned by currency speculation. Let's look at its growth. In 1988, $500 billion per day of currencies were traded or exchanged around the world. In 2001, $1 trillion a day. 2004, $2 trillion. 2010, $4 trillion. And by 2017, $5.3 trillion in currency were traded every day. Now, how much of that currency trading was connected to a company wanting to buy goods or services from a company in another country, and they needed the other country's currency to do it? What percent was connected to physical, real economic activity? Well, about 1%, meaning that the vast, vast majority is just gambling on the day-to-day price of the currencies. How can you have a stable system under that kind of regime? So, if you've ever wondered why since the early 1970s, average real wages in the US have not risen? Did you ever wonder why since that time the number of productive jobs in the US has sunk? Did you ever wonder when our US trade balance started going deeply negative? Take a look at the chart. Or did you ever wonder why after the late 1960s our NASA space budget collapsed? Why, after the 1960s, did the rate of real productivity growth in the US plummet to 1/3 of its value under the New Deal, World War II, and during the Bretton Woods system? Why was it that by the middle of the 1980s, loans made by industrial countries to developing nations were not leading to technological and industrial development, but were most often being defaulted on and bailed out with new loans at high interest rates? Well, the great 1971 flood of speculation had been let loose when London's attack tore down the FDR Bretton Woods system. Today, we need a new Bretton Woods international monetary system, and it means shutting down the British Empire. Ever since August 1971, Lyndon LaRouche has waged a war for a new Bretton Woods, built upon but better than the original. The world today needs a new global system of fixed currency exchange rates, of stability, with the goal of financing physical economic development. We'll shut down financial speculation and put the focus on the physical economy. After the 2007-2008 crash, LaRouche said that the 4 leading world powers, the US, China, Russia, India, they have to work together to create this new system. And today, with Trump's personal interest in positive relations with Russia and China, we have a serious chance to make this historic shift. In September 2018, the Schiller Institute, headed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, launched a new call for LaRouche's Bretton Woods, appealing directly to the leaders of these 4 nations. We've got to create this new system now before the global flood of speculation and of mounting debt triggers another crash like 2008, but far worse. As President Roosevelt said, we need action, and action now. We need your help. If you support our message, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to keep up to date with our videos. You can sign up with us here at LaRouche Back and help make this a reality by making a contribution to aid our efforts.
Questions? Very clear, very well.
You can thank Jason.
Well, Brian, if I remember correctly, this country has some experience with retooling. I mean, especially in a wartime economy, we went from making consumer goods and whatnot to armaments, and then transitioned back relatively smoothly after VE and VJ Day.
Right.
Yeah?
Roosevelt worked very closely with Walter Reuther. Walter Reuther had a whole team that put together a package proposal. Reuther, the head of the auto workers union, if I remember correctly, and this team. I mean, they mapped it out. You know, they knew the plants, they knew the capacities, and Roosevelt went with it. So there was a complete retooling of the auto sector for that. So absolutely, that's the model. If you happen to have a copy still, the United States joins the New Silk Road, a Hamiltonian vision for an economic renaissance. There's a few pages devoted to this retooling then and now. More on now, but referencing Reuther and Roosevelt's effort, successful effort then. Yeah. Yes, sir.
In reference to these loans that they were going to make to rejuvenate some of these other countries, I didn't hear anything about how they were going to collect their money if the other countries couldn't pay.
Well, it's the concept of generating demand. In other words, as opposed to a neoliberal liberal view, a classical liberal view.
More production, more money, and therefore they'd be able to pay it back.
Sure.
A lot of these countries, there's a lot of corruption. Money doesn't go where it's supposed to.
Well, that's yeah. I wish we had Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign here. I say that with a certain irony, but nonetheless, I wouldn't mind something in that direction happen. No, but to take your question seriously, look, the comprador class, including in the United States, that serves the interests of the colonial powers in London. That's created by London. Yes, it's exactly, to the extent you create a Hobbesian world of each against all, once that seems to be the only game in town, then of course the strong survive by crushing the weak, and so on and so forth, right? Exactly the opposite is what founded this country. It's exactly the opposite, which I was trying to emphasize by referencing again, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Schiller, but also Hamilton. That you don't build an economic system on that basis. You create and you cherish, the creative capacities of your people, right? And foster their development. That this is the fundamental resource of your nation. In making loans to developing countries, the effective demand most fundamentally is in the creative capacities of the people of those nations. Unleash those creative capacities. We're seeing this in Ethiopia now, right? Including U.S. companies are seeing it. You unleash those capacities and you multiply. You create a multiple of the costs of loans extended, of credit extended, to put that activity into